Today, however, was different. A silent, steel-like resolve had hardened inside her, a new feeling that burned away the familiar ache of sorrow. The decision, made in a single moment of clarity, was simple. She would leave. She would walk away from the name, the wealth, and the silence. As she moved through the vast, impersonal rooms, she felt a strange, almost dizzying lightness. The crystal chandeliers and priceless paintings that had once intimidated her now seemed pathetic, hollow symbols of a life she no longer wanted. Serena watched this unraveling with a cruel satisfaction. Julian's descent was the perfect cover for her final moves. She had been quietly accelerating her plan, feeding her employers at Zenith Innovations a steady stream of Vanstech's trade secrets and customer data. She had even convinced a few of Vanstech's key engineers, disgruntled by Julian's behavior, to begin discreetly working with Zenith. She saw the end approaching, not with a roar, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a hostile takeover. She made her way to the walk-in closet, a cavernous space filled with designer clothes she rarely wore. Tucked away in the back, behind the rows of unworn gowns, was a single, well-worn leather suitcase. It was a relic from her past, a reminder of the life she had packed away the day she married Julian. As she carefully folded a few simple outfits, a pair of jeans, a cotton shirt, her movements were deliberate and calm, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions she was finally allowing herself to feel. The climax of their toxic relationship came on a cold Tuesday afternoon. A major investor, spooked by the whispers in the media, had pulled out of a massive project, costing Vanstech billions. Julian, a vein throbbing in his temple, summoned Serena to his office. He paced like a caged animal, his suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, a far cry from the impeccable mogul he presented to the world. A muffled roar from the driveway below announced Julian's arrival. The sound of his Lamborghini was a signal, a final bell tolling the end of her old life. She closed the suitcase, the latch clicking shut with a sound that felt as final and significant as a slamming door. She zipped up a simple navy blue jacket, the first piece of clothing she had chosen for herself in years, and waited. "This is your fault, Serena!" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're my second in command. How could you let this happen? You were supposed to be watching my back, not playing some game with me." The elevator doors whispered open, and Julian strode in, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who owned the world. He tossed his keys onto a marble console without looking at her, his eyes already on the stock ticker glowing on a massive screen. Serena stood her ground, her face a mask of calm. "Julian, I've given you my best advice. I warned you about the risks. This is a PR issue, not a business one. We need to handle the media, not lash out at our own people." "Home already?" Julian Alara asked, her voice steady and even. Her calm only enraged him further. "Handle the media? You mean like my wife handles my social calendar? This isn't a party. Serena, this is my company, my legacy, and you're letting it burn. You and everyone else here is incompetent. I'm the only one who knows what's going on." He slammed his hand down on his desk, sending a glass of water toppling over, the spill a dark stain on the pristine mahogany. He turned, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "What's that? Did you finally decide to speak? Don't look so glum. You're a Vance. Act like it." The words were meant to be a command, a reminder of her place, but today they just sounded empty. "You're becoming unmanageable, Julian," Serena said, her voice dangerously quiet. She had a small, sleek device in her pocket, recording every word. She had been waiting for this moment, for him to admit his crimes and his tyranny. This was it, the final, hollow note of their 7 years together. He truly had no idea. He was so consumed by his own world, his own ego, that he couldn't see the woman in front of him wasn't sad she was gone. With a deep breath, Alara picked up the suitcase. The weight of it in her hand was a comfort, a promise. Julian's eyes widened, his face a mask of confusion, then annoyance. "Unmanageable, I built this from nothing. You're just a glorified secretary who got lucky." Julian's words were a torrent of venom, a reflection of his own fear and insecurity. He tore up a document on his desk, his eyes wild. "This is what happens when I give power to people who can't handle it. The board, my wife, you all think you can live in my shadow and not pay the price. Well, you'll all pay. I'll crush every single one of you." The silence of the sprawling penthouse was a polished, heavy thing, a constant companion to Alara Vance. For 7 years, It had been the soundtrack to her life, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city, the soft click of her heels on marble floors, and the echo of her husband Julian's cutting remarks. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a ghost against the glass, a woman dressed in a silk robe that felt more like a cage than a comfort. It was the uniform of her gilded imprisonment. Serena's facade of loyalty finally cracked, a cold smile forming on her lips. Your shadow, Julian. You've been so busy chasing Ilara and fighting ghosts, you never saw the real threat right in front of you. With that, she turned and walked out, the sound of his furious bellowing echoing down the hall. What do you think you're doing? Ilara, where are you going? He demanded, his voice now laced with a dangerous edge. Meanwhile, Ilara and Mr. Evans, sitting in a quiet coffee shop across the street, watched the drama unfold. The journalist, Leo, had just called with a tip about the massive project failure. Ilara saw Serena leave the Vanstech tower, her expression a mix of triumph and cold calculation. She saw the panic on the faces of employees who were streaming out of the building. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was no longer just a spectator. Julian's own actions were becoming his greatest weapon against himself. He was unraveling, and his arrogance, which had been his shield for so long, was now his greatest weakness. The game was reaching its final stage, and all Ilara had to do was watch as he self-destructed. The moment of reckoning was finally at hand. The coffee shop across from the Vanstech Tower had become Ilara's new observation post. She and Mr. Evans, a silent and vigilant pair, watched the corporate titan's kingdom crumble in real time. The stream of departing employees was a river of disillusionment, each one carrying a piece of Julian's broken reputation with them. Leo, the young journalist, had become their unofficial informant. His latest scoop, a devastating exposé on the failed project, was a direct result of the chaos Julian had created. The article didn't just mention the financial loss. It painted a picture of a CEO losing his grip, a man whose volatile behavior was now a public spectacle. Ilara didn't answer. She simply walked past him, a small, resolute figure heading for the elevator. She had no destination in mind, only the unwavering certainty that she was finally leaving. Julian Vance watched the elevator doors close, a flicker of disbelief giving way to a slow, burning rage. Ilara was not supposed to leave. Ilara was a beautifully packaged part of his life that existed only to reflect his success. The divorce petition he found on the kitchen counter, tucked neatly under a vase of wilting flowers, seemed like a joke, a flimsy piece of paper against the impenetrable wall of his will. He crumpled it in his fist, the sound a low, aggressive crackle. She had no money, no connections, and no spine. She would be back. She had to be. Julian, besieged on all sides, had retreated into his penthouse, a castle under siege. He had fired his entire executive team, including Serena, in a fit of paranoid rage. He had no one left to talk to, no one to trust. The only company he had was his own ego, and it was screaming for a scapegoat. The world he had so meticulously built was now nothing more than a fragile house of cards, collapsing under its own weight. He had no idea that the most devastating blow was still to come, and it would be delivered by the person he least expected. He immediately set out to make her return inevitable. A few phone calls to his contacts, a few whispers to the right people, and Ilara's name was quietly blacklisted from the social circles she had never cared for in the first place. He had her personal bank accounts frozen, assuming she would soon run out of the meager cash she'd been able to grab. In his mind, he was simply reminding her of her place, of the reality that without him, she was nothing. He was a king, and she was a pawn who had dared to step off the board. Ilara's final move was a calculated risk. She couldn't simply hand over the incriminating files. Julian was too powerful, his legal team too ruthless. They would bury the evidence, discredit her, and turn the tables on her. She needed a way to make the information public, undeniable, and impossible to retract. She needed to hit him where he was most vulnerable, his private server. The digital vault he believed was his fortress. But Julian, in his monumental arrogance, had missed one crucial detail. His kingdom was built on the shaky foundations of his ego, while Ilara's plan had been laid out with the quiet strength of a woman who had spent years observing him from the shadows. Long before she packed that single suitcase, she had been preparing, with the help of Mr. Evans, a kind, retired gentleman who had once managed her late father's small business. She had a contingency plan. Mr. Evans, a man of quiet wisdom and meticulous habits, had been her one true friend in the lonely years of her marriage. Elara knew the layout of the Vanstech Tower by heart. She had spent 7 years there, an unseen observer in the background of his life. She knew the service corridors, the emergency exits, and the security blind spots. She and Mr. Evans had spent weeks planning, using her knowledge and his technical expertise. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane, but it was their only chance. Elara's new life began in a small, white 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood Julian wouldn't be caught dead in. It was a world away from the penthouse. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, the furniture was comfortable but worn, and the air smelled of coffee and old books. Not sterile cleaning products. This modest sanctuary felt more like home than any of the gilded rooms she had left behind. The night of the operation was a blur of adrenaline and fear, dressed in the simple, unassuming clothes she now favored. Elara slipped into the Vanstech building through a service entrance, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Mr. Evans, a master of misdirection, had created a small power surge in a different part of the building, a harmless distraction that would buy her precious minutes. She wasn't a Vance here. She was just Elara. She spent her first few days in a daze, the shock of her new freedom giving way to a sense of profound peace. She registered for a small, local bank account that Julian would never think to check, and used the small stash of emergency cash she had been saving for years. It was a humble beginning, but with every small, independent act buying groceries, making her own bed, walking down the street unnoticed, she felt a new part of herself awaken. She had escaped the cage, and the air outside, though simple, tasted like true freedom. The community center was a kaleidoscope of life, a stark and vibrant contrast to the monochromatic world Elara had left behind. There was the cheerful chaos of the children's art class, the gentle chatter of the elderly book club, and the rhythmic thrum of the sewing machines. She had taken a job as a general assistant, a position Julian would have found laughable. Here, she wasn't a socialite or a trophy wife. She was simply Elara, a friendly woman who helped organize events, answer phones, and sort through the endless stacks of paperwork that accumulated in the small office. For the first time in years, her days were filled with purpose that had nothing to do with maintaining a flawless facade. She moved through the silent corridors, the familiar feel of the building a strange comfort. She found the hidden room, a small, unassuming door that looked like an electrical closet. Inside, the server hummed, a digital heart beating in the darkness. She worked quickly, her hands trembling as she attached a small device Mr. Evans had given her. It was a digital ghost, a program designed to copy all the data on the server and transmit it to a secure, anonymous network. The entire process took only a few terrifying minutes. Her small apartment, with its sunlit kitchen and overflowing bookshelf, was a refuge. The simple act of cooking her own meals and choosing her own schedule felt like a luxury. She had started painting again, a passion she had abandoned a decade ago. The canvases in her living room were a riot of color, a visual diary of her reawakening spirit. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for this humble, hard-won existence, and for Mr. Evans, who checked in on her weekly, a knowing twinkle in his eye as he saw her blossom. As she made her escape, she heard the faint sound of alarms and saw the flash of security lights. Julian had finally realized something was wrong, but it was too late. Elara slipped out into the cold night, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had done it. She had released the truth. The anonymous files, now safely uploaded, would soon be in the hands of the world's most prominent investigative journalists. One humid Tuesday, the center's director, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, approached Elara with a new task. "The old annex needs a major cleanup," she said, gesturing to a dusty, low-ceilinged storage unit behind the main building. "It's full of junk from a dozen different past projects. I need someone to go through it, organize what's salvageable, and toss the rest." The next morning, the headlines screamed a different story. Vanstech's stock plummeted, and the internet was abuzz with leaked documents, revealing a complex web of fraud, corporate espionage, and the systematic destruction of small businesses. The evidence was irrefutable, and the world watched in stunned silence as Julian's empire crumbled. He was arrested in his penthouse, a man utterly alone, his arrogance a broken shield against the truth he had so carefully hidden. The task was daunting, but Ilara accepted it with a smile. It was mindless work, a perfect way to clear her head. She spent the next 2 days hauling out musty boxes and sweeping away cobwebs. The storage unit was a chaotic time capsule, filled with everything from obsolete computer equipment to faded flyers for forgotten events. In her small, sunlit apartment, Ilara received a call from Mr. Evans. "It's over, Ilara," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and pride. "He's done for. And you're free." Ilara looked out her window, not at the high-rises and the bustling city, but at the small, vibrant community below. Her gilded cage was gone, replaced by a life of purpose, friendship, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had found her own strength. She was not a victim, not a trophy wife. She was Ilara, and she had just set the world right. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving quiet. Ilara, now known publicly as a whistleblower, was no longer a ghost. She was a figure of quiet strength, a woman who had toppled a giant. The media, once focused on the scandal, now wanted to tell her story. They saw a narrative of resilience, of a woman who had found her voice after years of silence. But Ilara, with the humility of a true hero, shunned the spotlight. She gave a single, carefully worded statement, acknowledging her part in exposing the truth, and then retreated back into the quiet life she had built. It was on the 3rd day that she found it, tucked behind a large, rusted filing cabinet. In a small, unmarked box were a few files that were different from the rest. The folders were clean, the paper crisp, and the labels were coated with a series of alphanumeric strings that meant nothing to her. The first one she opened contained a series of financial ledgers, but instead of standard names, the accounts were labeled with acronyms like Project Chimera and Project Cerberus. A shiver ran down her spine. The logos on some of the documents were unmistakable. They were VanceTech, Julian's company. Her small apartment became a sanctuary once again. The vibrant canvases, once pushed aside, now took center stage. Ilara spent her days painting, her brushstrokes filled with a new sense of freedom and purpose. The colors were brighter, the lines more confident, each piece a testament to her journey. She found a new community in the local art scene, a world where she was valued for her talent. Not for her name or her husband's wealth, she taught art classes at the community center, her gentle guidance inspiring a new generation of artists. Her life, once defined by the walls of a penthouse, was now as boundless as her imagination. Her heart began to pound in her chest. Julian had a habit of delegating small, seemingly insignificant tasks to her, things that were beneath his notice. Years ago, he had told her to clear out a similar storage unit he used for old business ventures. She had dutifully done so, boxing everything up and placing it in this very annex. She had never been curious enough to look inside the boxes then. The fear of Julian's displeasure was a powerful deterrent. Now, that fear was gone, replaced by a growing curiosity and a deep sense of dread. Mr. Evans, her partner in this quiet war, remained her closest friend. The two of them would often sit in her living room, drinking tea and talking about everything from the scandal to the best way to plant a garden. He had become a grandfather figure to her, a constant reminder that kindness and integrity were forces more powerful than any corporate empire. She spent the rest of the day poring over the documents in the quiet of her apartment, her art supplies pushed aside. The more she read, the more the pieces started to fit together in a horrifying puzzle. The files were not just financial records. They were a trail of corporate espionage. There were emails detailing how VanceTech had acquired a rival company's technology, not through a legitimate merger, but through a calculated hack that had crippled the competitor. There were also records of payments to a shell corporation, seemingly for consulting services, but the amounts were astronomical and the services vaguely described. As she dug deeper, she found names and addresses of small-time inventors and startups whose intellectual property had been mysteriously acquired for a pittance or, in some cases, stolen outright. Julian had even used his own company's charity foundation as a front to funnel money into these illegal activities, making the transactions seem legitimate and benevolent. Julian, now a disgraced figure, was a cautionary tale. He faced a multitude of legal charges, and his once impenetrable reputation was in tatters. The empire he had built on greed and deception had crumbled, and he was left with nothing but his shame. The penthouse, his gilded cage, was now a hollow reminder of a life he had lost. The world had moved on, and Julian Vance, once a titan, was now nothing more than a footnote in a history of corporate greed. This wasn't the Julian she had married. The man she knew was arrogant, dismissive, and cold, but she had always believed he was an honest, albeit ruthless, businessman. This Julian was a criminal. He was a thief, a cheat, a man who built his empire on the broken dreams and stolen ideas of others. The elegant facade of his success was rotten to the core. A particular file caught her eye: Operation Nightingale, which detailed the calculated takedown of a promising medical technology startup, leaving its founder, a brilliant young engineer, bankrupt and discredited. The details were clinical, cold, and utterly devastating. Alara felt a wave of nausea. She knew the name of the startup. She had once read about it in a magazine and had briefly mentioned it to Julian, who had dismissed it as child's play. And what of Serena, the cunning executive who had orchestrated her own betrayal? She had failed. Her hostile takeover of Vance Tech had been thwarted by the scandal. The company, now under federal investigation, was a toxic asset. And her employers at Zenith Innovations had cut all ties with her, leaving her with a ruined reputation and a tarnished career. She had gambled everything on Julian's downfall, never realizing that her own betrayal would be a part of his self-destruction. In the end, the two of them, the king and his aspiring queen, were left with nothing but the ruins of their own ambition. The discovery changed everything. Her divorce was no longer a simple escape from an unhappy marriage. It was a fight against a powerful, dangerous man who had hurt countless people. She realized that she had been a silent accomplice, a wife who had benefited from this ill-gotten wealth, albeit unknowingly. The thought was a sickening jolt, one that filled her with a fierce, protective anger. The pain she had felt from his neglect was a pinprick compared to the damage he had inflicted on others. Alara's story was not one of revenge, but of liberation. She had not sought to destroy Julian, but to free herself from his oppressive shadow and to right the wrongs she had unknowingly been a part of. The truth she had uncovered was not just a weapon against him, but a key to her own freedom. She had found a life of quiet contentment, of genuine friendships, and of a passion that had been buried for years. The gilded cage was no more. The woman who had once been a prisoner of her own silence was now a master of her own destiny, her canvas a reflection of the beautiful, messy, and infinitely free life she had finally found. A year has passed. As the evening light faded, Alara sat surrounded by the incriminating files, a single thought forming with absolute clarity in her mind. She could not just walk away and be free, not while this injustice existed. She held the files in her hands, the paper feeling heavy and significant. Julian had assumed she was weak and spineless. He had built his entire life on the belief that he could take whatever he wanted and face no consequences. But he had forgotten one thing she had been watching. And now, she had the truth. Her quiet escape had just become a quest for justice. The gilded cage was gone, but the ghost of its corruption lingered, and Alara knew she was the only one who could expose it. Julian Vance sat in the cavernous, minimalist office that occupied the entire top floor of the Vance Tech Tower, a glass and steel monument to his own genius. The city below sprawled out like a subservient kingdom, but he saw none of its beauty. His mind was a maelstrom of petty annoyances. Alara's continued absence was a scratch on the flawless surface of his life, an itch he couldn't reach. The freeze on her accounts and the quiet social ban had, to his shock, failed to produce the desired result. The phone was silent, her friends were no help. He couldn't believe her audacity. He, Julian Vance, was being defied by a woman he had long considered a decorative piece of furniture. Alara's life, now, is no longer a story of the past but a vivid picture of the present. She has opened a small studio near the community center, a space filled with natural light and the smell of oil paint. It is not only a place where she creates, but also an open space where people can come and learn. Her painting classes are always full of students, from curious children to adults looking to find their lost passion. She is no longer just an artist, but an instructor, an inspiration. His rage, however, was a misplaced weapon. While he was fixated on a ghost of a woman he had underestimated, the real threat was a living, breathing viper sitting just across from his desk. Serena, His executive vice president, and for the past 2 years, his discreet mistress, was the picture of corporate poise, with her sharp bob, impeccable suits, and coolly intelligent eyes. She was the polar opposite of Alara. Where Alara was quiet and introspective, Serena was all ambition and calculation, a perfect reflection of the man Julian saw in the mirror. He believed she was a testament to his own shrewdness, a loyal acolyte who worshipped at the altar of his success. In truth, she saw him as a stepping stone. Alara's studio is also where she and Mr. Evans often meet. They still have the habit of having afternoon tea, but now, they no longer discuss intrigue or legal strategy. Instead, they discuss art, the seeds in the community garden, and the little things that bring happiness. Mr. Evans, with his calm and wise demeanor, became a confidant, an indispensable part of her new life. Serena watched Julian's simmering anger with a detached, clinical interest. She had, in fact, been feeding him information about Alara's movements, or lack thereof. "I'm told her little nest egg must be running dry by now," she would say, her voice as smooth as silk. "She's likely too proud to crawl back just yet, but she will." She knew exactly what Julian wanted to hear, and she fed his ego like a starving beast. She was a master of misdirection, a puppeteer pulling his strings while he thought he was pulling hers. As for Julian, his name gradually faded from public memory. Despite facing numerous criminal charges, he managed to escape prison thanks to a team of skilled lawyers. However, his legacy collapsed, his assets were confiscated, his reputation was ruined, and he lived a lonely life, ostracized by society. The penthouse, a symbol of his power, now belonged to Alara after the divorce proceedings. But she decided to sell it. She did not want to keep anything from her old life, because her new life, though simple, was more precious than anything. Serena was no ordinary rival. She was a mole from Zenith Innovations, a tech giant that had long played second fiddle to Vance Tech. Her mission was simple and brutal: to dismantle Julian's empire from the inside out and seize control. For years, she had been systematically siphoning off Vance Tech's most valuable intellectual property and business strategies, creating a digital trail so convoluted and subtle that only a team of forensic experts could ever untangle it. She had planted backdoors in the company's servers, manipulated market data to create phantom profits, and even covertly sabotaged a few of Julian's key projects, all while maintaining the guise of a loyal, indispensable right hand. And Serena, that ambitious woman, did not escape her fate. Zenith Innovations completely denied any connection with her after the Vance Tech scandal. She tried to return to the business world, but every door was closed. Serena became a byword for blind greed and betrayal, a pale shadow in the world she once aspired to dominate. One evening, as Julian fumed about a failed merger that had cost him millions, he turned to Serena, his face a mask of frustration. "It's all falling apart. My team, my projects, my own wife leaving me." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. "I can't lose control. Not now." Alara could no longer see them. Her life had turned a new page, and those people were a thing of the past. She had learned that happiness lay not in wealth or power, but in freedom and true love. She no longer lived in a gilded cage. She lived in a house filled with light, colorful paintings, and the laughter of her friends. It was a life Alara had created herself, her own masterpiece. And that was the sweetest revenge. She had won, not by destroying, but by building. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more tales of drama, romance, and unexpected twists coming your way. Stay with us for the next one. And while you're here, check out our other videos. There's always more to explore. Serena placed a comforting hand on his arm, her touch as cold as her smile. "It's a temporary setback, Julian, a few minor course corrections, and we'll be back on top. We'll show them all. Your wife, the board, everyone." She delivered the line with practiced sincerity, all the while thinking of the next piece of crucial data she would be sending to her real employers that night. She had already set in motion the final act of her plan: a hostile takeover of Vance Tech, with Julian's every weakness and every secret weaponized against him. The seeds of betrayal had been planted long before Alara's departure, but Julian's misplaced fury had given them the perfect conditions to grow into a fatal, flourishing vine. He was so focused on the wife he thought was his enemy, He never saw the lover who was his undoing. The old library, with its scent of aged paper and leather-bound books, had always been a sanctuary for Alara. Now, it was her war room. A single, heavy oak table was covered with the incriminating files from the storage unit, a chaotic map of Julian's deceit. She had a new purpose, a newfound strength, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. The documents were a labyrinth of shell corporations, encrypted emails, and complex financial schemes that she, an artist with a background in art history, couldn't possibly decipher on her own. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Her first call was to Mr. Evans, the retired forensic accountant, with his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose and his perpetually kind smile, arrived with a worn briefcase and a look of quiet determination. "I knew you had it in you." "Alara," he said, his voice a soft, steady anchor in her sea of anxiety. He saw the files, and his eyes, which had been gentle and avuncular, sharpened with a professional intensity. He spent the next 3 days in a silent trance, surrounded by ledgers and spreadsheets, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. Meanwhile, Alara, using her intimate knowledge of Julian's habits, began to play a game of chess. She knew his schedule, his favorite restaurants, and the names of the trusted few he actually paid attention to. She remembered him mentioning a young, ambitious journalist named Leo, who had once written a scathing article about one of VanceTech's rivals. Julian had been impressed by his tenacity, even if he dismissed him as a penniless hack. Alara saw an ally. She knew Julian's ego would make him incapable of believing that she, his quiet wife, could ever be a source of trouble. He was too busy chasing phantoms to see the real threat. Alara's plan was a delicate balancing act. She couldn't expose everything at once. Julian's power was too vast, his connections too deep. A full frontal attack would be suicide. She had to leak information slowly, like a poison, to create an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt. She began with a small, innocuous-looking email to the journalist, anonymously tipping him off about a suspicious transaction involving a shell corporation and VanceTech's charity foundation. She used a public library's computer, a tactic Mr. Evans had suggested, leaving no digital trail that could be traced back to her. The first article, a small blurb in an obscure business blog, was a test. It was enough to cause a ripple of concern in the financial community, but not enough to trigger Julian's full-scale investigation. He dismissed it as a smear campaign, the work of a disgruntled competitor. Alara and Mr. Evans watched from the sidelines, their eyes on Julian's every move, anticipating his arrogance and using it against him. They knew he would underestimate the small fire until it was a raging inferno. Mr. Evans, with his vast experience and quiet genius, was slowly piecing together a comprehensive picture of Julian's corporate crimes. He unearthed evidence of insider trading, of a multi-million-dollar bribe to a government official, and of the systematic destruction of several small startups. He created a meticulous, almost foolproof case, but they needed to find a way to make it public without putting themselves in danger. Alara found her second move in an old, forgotten memory. She had once overheard Julian boasting about a specific, private server where he stored his most valuable secrets. He had said it was untraceable and impenetrable. She remembered his excitement, his almost childlike glee in his own cleverness. It was a detail she had forgotten until now. She knew where the server was, in a hidden room within the VanceTech building. It was a physical weak point, a single point of failure in his digital fortress. Her plan began to take shape, a final, desperate play that would put everything on the line, but could bring his empire to its knees. Julian's distraction with Alara was a gift from the gods. His paranoia, which he directed entirely at his estranged wife, left him blind to the real breaches in his security. He had wasted valuable time and resources trying to track a woman who was quietly building a new life for herself. While Serena was actively dismantling his legacy piece by piece, she would subtly nudge him toward bad decisions, all under the pretense of protecting his interests. The game was no longer about her freedom. It was about justice. The gentle, quiet wife had become a master strategist, a woman fighting for the victims Julian had left in his wake. As she and Mr. Evans worked late into the night, the glow of her apartment and the warmth of her newfound friendship felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one that was far more valuable than any amount of money. The small sparks Alara had ignited began to take hold, growing into a low, smoldering fire that Julian, in his hubris, was still convinced he could extinguish with a single glance. The articles, initially dismissed as insignificant, began to appear with greater frequency and in more reputable publications. They were small jabs at first, questioning Vanstech's recent financial reports, hinting at a lack of transparency, and alluding to a charitable foundation with a questionable outflow of funds. Each article, like a needle pricking at his inflated ego, made him angrier and more erratic. Julian, a titan of the tech world, saw her as an accessory, a beautiful, quiet object to be displayed at galas and corporate events. Their marriage was a meticulously crafted facade, one that had long ago ceased to have any real meaning. His world was one of deals, deadlines, and dazzling young women who flattered his ego. Alara's world was confined to these walls, a life of endless sterile perfection. She had endured the loneliness, the casual neglect, and the subtle humiliation for so long she had almost forgotten the woman she used to be, a vibrant artist, with a fierce spirit, and dreams that stretched far beyond any high-rise. Julian's paranoia, previously directed at Alara, now turned inward. He began to see enemies everywhere. The smallest disagreement from a board member was perceived as an act of treason. He screamed at his executive team, accusing them of leaking information, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment that had his most loyal employees questioning their dedication. He was becoming unhinged, a man who had built his empire on control and was now watching it slip through his fingers. He had always been a micromanager, but now he was a tyrant,